June 30, 1941. Lviv, occupied Ukraine. The city does not wake to chaos. It wakes to control. Boots strike stone in steady rhythm. Radios hum behind open windows. Typewriters chatter inside seized offices, where new orders are being drafted faster than the ink can dry. German forces have entered Lviv ahead of schedule, advancing with a speed that leaves even their own planners slightly unsettled. The maps said this would take longer. The resistance was supposed to be heavier. Instead, the city feels strangely open, almost expectant. Inside a former administrative building, German officers spread intelligence summaries across a long table. These documents were prepared months earlier, written in Berlin, refined by analysts who believed they understood what awaited them in the East. The reports outlined troop movements, rail lines, and expected Soviet responses. But now, as new pages are added from the field, something does not fit. Flags are being raised that are not German. Proclamations are circulating that were never approved. And one name appears again and again in urgent field notes, written more often in the margins than in the official text. The Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, the OUN. This moment did not arrive by accident. Long before German soldiers entered Lviv, German intelligence had been wrestling with a problem that tanks and aircraft could not solve. The deeper the Wehrmacht planned to move into Soviet territory, the more vulnerable it would become behind the front lines. German planners understood this well. They remembered the First World War. They understood that occupying territory was easy compared to holding it. Vast distances, hostile populations, and fragile supply lines made partisan warfare not a possibility, but an inevitability. In the late 1930s, German intelligence turned its attention to the fractured political landscape of Eastern Europe. Reports from the borderlands described populations shaped by repression, famine, and fear. Among them, Ukrainian nationalist movements stood out. German analysts noted their deep hostility towards Soviet rule, their experience operating underground, and their ability to mobilize locally without centralized command. These were qualities German planners valued, not because they respected them, but because they could be exploited. The records show no romanticism. There is no language of partnership. The OUN is never described as an ally. Instead, it appears as a variable, a force that might be directed, at least temporarily, toward German goals. Intelligence memoranda speak in cautious terms, emphasizing utility over ideology. Ukrainian nationalism is framed not as a cause, but as a tool, something to be used and, when necessary, discarded. Yet even in these early assessments, warning signs appear. German officers noted that the OUN was not a single, unified organization. It was divided by leadership rivalries and competing visions of what independence should look like. It had survived years of Soviet repression by learning how to operate autonomously, without relying on outside powers. That independence made it resilient. It also made it dangerous. One report warned that Ukrainian nationalists could not be permanently subordinated. Their cooperation would depend entirely on circumstance, not loyalty. German command believed this risk could be managed. The logic was simple. Germany would never recognize an independent Ukraine. That decision had already been made at the highest levels. The eastern territories were to be exploited, not liberated. But German planners also believed that nationalist aspirations could be kept vague, deliberately unresolved, long enough to serve the immediate needs of the invasion. The OUN would be tolerated in the shadows, allowed to operate informally, useful in the opening phase, irrelevant once control was secured. This calculated ambiguity became policy. As plans for Operation Barbarossa solidified, German intelligence increased contact with Ukrainian nationalist intermediaries. The tone of the correspondence is cold and technical. There are no promises, no written guarantees. The language revolves around coordination, facilitation, and local assistance. Guides who know the terrain, interpreters who can navigate villages without drawing attention, organizers who can keep roads open and identify Soviet holdouts. German officers viewed these roles as purely functional. The OUN was expected to assist and then disappear into the background, absorbed by the machinery of occupation. What the documents fail to account for is expectation. Not German expectation, which is carefully recorded, but Ukrainian expectation, which is largely absent from the files. When the invasion begins, early reports seem to validate German assumptions. Units advance rapidly through regions where nationalist networks are active. Field commanders report fewer disruptions, smoother logistics, and surprisingly little resistance in some areas. The language in the documents carries a quiet confidence. The mechanism appears to be working. Nationalism, German command believes, has been successfully weaponized. But this confidence rests on a misunderstanding. German planners assumed that hatred of Soviet rule would naturally translate into obedience to German authority. They mistook a shared enemy for a shared future. The files do not say this explicitly. They do not need to. The assumption is embedded in the structure of the planning itself. Ukrainian nationalism is treated as reactive, not aspirational, something that exists only in opposition to Moscow, not as a vision of its own. Lviv exposes that error. Within days of the German advance, German administrators receive reports that are difficult to categorize. OUN members are acting independently. Declarations of Ukrainian statehood are being circulated without approval. Public actions are being taken that suggest political ambition, not quiet cooperation. Flags appear that symbolize something Germany never intended to permit. The response inside German command is not immediate outrage. It is confusion. Field officers write back to Berlin asking for clarification. Was this expected? Was it permitted? The answers come slowly, and when they do, they are deliberately vague. German command does not yet see this as a crisis. It sees it as a complication, something to be adjusted, managed, corrected. The language in the records shifts subtly. Words like cooperative give way to terms such as politically unreliable and ideologically unstable. The tone is changing, even if the policy has not yet caught up. What German command does not yet fully grasp is that the same qualities that made the OUN useful now make it uncontrollable. Independence, once tolerated, now appears threatening. Local initiative, once praised, now looks like defiance. The contradiction sits at the heart of the relationship, unacknowledged, but increasingly impossible to ignore. In private correspondence, German officers begin to express unease. They note that nationalist networks operate faster than occupation structures can respond. That loyalty is personal and local, not hierarchical. That orders issued in Berlin lose meaning once they reach the villages and streets where real control is exercised. Lviv becomes a warning sign. German command has not yet decided what to do, but it understands something has shifted. The relationship is no longer defined solely by utility. It is now defined by uncertainty. The question is no longer how to use the OUN effectively, but whether it can be controlled at all. The documents do not yet use the word mistake. That comes later. For now, they record tension, hesitation, and an awareness that something fundamental has been misjudged. The opening phase of the invasion is supposed to be the easiest. Instead, German command finds itself confronting a problem it did not plan for. Not resistance, not sabotage, but ambition. And that is the danger German planners failed to calculate. If you want to understand how these moments, buried deep inside wartime records, shape decisions that still echo today, subscribe to WW2 Never Told German Files and tell us where you're watching from around the world. The files do not explain themselves. That comes next. The German advance continues eastward, and on paper it looks like success. Reports arriving from the front in the summer of 1941 describe roads opened faster than expected, rail lines secured with minimal delay, and towns entering German control without prolonged fighting. To planners in Berlin, this is confirmation. The strategy appears sound. The gamble appears to be paying off. Inside German field headquarters, officers read situation reports that speak of cooperation without enthusiasm, of assistance without formal agreement. Ukrainian nationalist networks are mentioned indirectly, often folded into vague phrases like local elements or auxiliary support. The absence of detail is intentional. German command does not want these arrangements examined too closely. They are meant to be temporary, and temporary things are easier to manage when they remain undefined. At the tactical level, cooperation becomes routine. Guides lead columns through back roads that maps do not show. Interpreters smooth encounters with civilians who might otherwise slow the advance. Intelligence on Soviet withdrawals arrives with unusual speed. German officers do not ask too many questions. Momentum is everything, and momentum is being maintained. But beneath that momentum, contradictions begin to surface. German command assumes that nationalist cooperation is passive, that it exists only in reaction to Soviet collapse. What the files do not acknowledge openly is that Ukrainian nationalist actors are moving with their own timetable. Their actions are not simply responses to German orders. They are steps toward objectives Germany has never sanctioned. This disconnect is subtle at first. Field officers report minor incidents that seem insignificant on their own. Unauthorized meetings, public speeches delivered without approval, local symbols appearing alongside German authority rather than beneath it. Each report is treated as an anomaly, a side effect of rapid movement and imperfect control. Then the anomalies accumulate. Inside occupation offices, German administrators begin receiving documents they did not request. Declarations written in Ukrainian. Statements referencing statehood, sovereignty, and national destiny. These papers circulate independently of German channels, passed hand to hand, posted publicly before occupation authorities can react. The language is unmistakable. This is not cooperation. This is assertion. German command reacts slowly, not because it is indifferent, but because it is uncertain. The original plan never accounted for this scenario. There is no clear directive for dealing with nationalist ambition that exceeds its assigned role. Berlin issues instructions that emphasize calm and restraint. The priority remains the war against the Soviet Union. Internal political disputes are to be deferred. This hesitation becomes the first opening. OUN networks exploit the ambiguity. They move faster than German administrators can regulate. They speak to the population in terms German proclamations avoid. They frame the German advance not as occupation, but as opportunity. For German officers trained to think in terms of military hierarchy, this is difficult to counter. Authority on paper does not translate into authority on the street. The first major rupture arrives quietly. German administrators in Lviv and surrounding regions begin reporting that nationalist actors are acting without consultation, organizing structures parallel to occupation authority. Local police formations emerge that answer to nationalist leadership rather than German command. German officers realize that control, once assumed, was never established. The language inside the records shifts again. Words like useful and cooperative disappear. In their place appear phrases such as politically unreliable and ideologically unpredictable. These are not emotional judgments. They are administrative classifications. And once applied, they carry consequences. Arrest lists begin circulating. Surveillance intensifies. German security services are instructed to identify nationalist leaders and monitor their movements. What had been tolerated as informal cooperation is now being reframed as a potential threat. Yet even as these measures begin, German command hesitates to act decisively. Because the advance is still underway, German units remain dependent on local knowledge in territories they barely understand. Roads, villages, forests, and supply routes still require guidance. Cutting ties too abruptly risks slowing the campaign at a moment when speed is critical. The contradiction deepens. The moment German command begins to fear the OUN is the same moment it still needs it. This is the first true turning point. The files show a tension between two priorities that cannot be reconciled. Military necessity demands continued informal cooperation. Political control demands suppression. German command attempts to do both at once, and in doing so, satisfies neither. If you're still following this story, this is the kind of decision-making buried inside the archives that defines WW2 Never Told German Files. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching from, because these moments were never meant to be examined this closely. As the summer turns to autumn, the consequences of this indecision become harder to ignore. German security reports describe nationalist groups operating beyond German oversight, using German presence as cover while advancing their own agenda. Arrests provoke backlash rather than compliance. Suppression creates martyrs rather than silence. German officers begin to understand something unsettling. The OUN was never waiting to be activated by Germany. It was already in motion. Internal correspondence reveals growing frustration. Officers complain that nationalist actors do not respond to orders as expected, that loyalty cannot be enforced through intimidation alone, that the very decentralization which made these networks resilient under Soviet rule now makes them impossible to dismantle cleanly. This realization marks the second major shift. German command abandons the illusion of partnership, but it does not fully commit to eradication. Instead, it adopts a strategy of containment. Nationalist leaders are arrested selectively. Networks are disrupted, but not destroyed. Cooperation continues unofficially in some areas, even as it is condemned in others. The records reflect this contradiction with uncomfortable clarity. In one report, an officer warns that nationalist elements pose a long-term security threat. In the next, a different unit notes that operations would have failed without local assistance. Both assessments are accurate. Both are incompatible. This is the moment when German command loses narrative control in its own documentation. The files no longer tell a coherent story of intent. They record reactions, adjustments, reversals. The confidence of early planning is gone, replaced by language that suggests improvisation rather than strategy. German command is no longer directing events. It is responding to them. Another quiet escalation follows. OUN networks, now aware that German tolerance is eroding, begin operating more discreetly. Public declarations give way to clandestine organization. Cooperation becomes transactional rather than ideological. German units on the ground strike quiet arrangements that contradict official policy, because survival and success matter more than consistency. This dual reality creates fractures within German administration itself. Security services push for harsher measures. Military commanders resist, arguing that excessive repression will undermine operational effectiveness. Berlin receives conflicting recommendations, each grounded in legitimate concerns. The result is paralysis. By late 1941, German command has effectively lost the initiative in its relationship with Ukrainian nationalism. What began as a calculated gamble has become an unstable balancing act. The OUN is no longer simply useful, nor is it openly hostile. It occupies a space German planners never intended to create, caught between necessity and fear. If these contradictions surprise you, subscribe to WW2 Never Told German Files and tell us where you're watching from. Because what happens next is not escalation. It is something far more damaging: disillusionment. German officers begin to question not just the OUN, but their own assumptions. Private correspondence hints at a deeper concern: that nationalism cannot be weaponized without consequence. That local ambition does not dissolve simply because a stronger power arrives. The files stop pretending otherwise. And as winter approaches, German command faces a reality it had not planned for. The war in the East is no longer just a military campaign. It is a struggle over control, legitimacy, and meaning. One that German authority alone cannot resolve. The illusion of control has collapsed. What replaces it is uncertainty. And uncertainty in occupied territory is lethal. What German command chooses to do next will define the relationship permanently. Not as cooperation, not as alliance, but as something far darker and far more revealing. That decision comes next. By early 1942, German records no longer describe a relationship. They describe a problem. The language changes first. Where earlier files spoke of coordination and facilitation, the reports now speak of containment, surveillance, and risk management. Ukrainian nationalist networks are no longer treated as temporary assets. They are cataloged as destabilizing factors, not enemies in the conventional sense, but something more difficult to classify. Too organized to ignore, too embedded to eliminate without cost. German command has reached the second realization it never intended to face. Despite arrests, despite suppression orders, despite intelligence crackdowns, the OUN does not disappear. Internal security reports admit this indirectly. They note continued nationalist influence in rural areas. They acknowledge that German authority weakens beyond major roads and cities. Villages comply outwardly, but loyalty is local, personal, and conditional. German control exists on paper. On the ground, it fractures. This is where the contradiction becomes impossible to hide. Even as German command authorizes harsher measures against nationalist leaders, operational reports continue to reference the same local knowledge Germany depends on to function. Roads are still navigated. Supplies still move. Intelligence still flows. Quietly, informally, often through the same channels German security services are ordered to dismantle. The files do not reconcile this. They simply record it. By mid-1942, correspondence between military commanders and occupation authorities reveals open disagreement. Security officials argue that Ukrainian nationalism must be crushed decisively before it evolves into a broader resistance movement. Field commanders push back. They warn that excessive repression will ignite exactly the kind of partisan war Germany is least equipped to fight. Both sides cite evidence. Both are correct. German command does nothing to resolve the dispute. Instead, it allows contradiction to harden into policy. Selective arrests continue. High-profile figures are removed. Networks are disrupted, but never fully destroyed. In some regions, nationalist activity is suppressed aggressively. In others, it is quietly tolerated if it serves immediate military needs. The result is fragmentation, not control. A patchwork of inconsistent authority that undermines German credibility with every passing month. This inconsistency has consequences. German war diaries from late 1942 begin to reflect exhaustion. Not physical exhaustion, but administrative fatigue. Officers write of confusion, overlapping orders, and unreliable local compliance. The certainty of early planning is gone. In its place is a recognition that Germany has entered a political terrain it does not understand and cannot master through force alone. The irony becomes sharper as the war turns. As Soviet forces regroup and partisan activity intensifies, German command finds itself increasingly dependent on precisely the kind of local intelligence it has spent months trying to suppress. Reports acknowledge that nationalist networks still exert influence in areas where German patrols are vulnerable. Even when cooperation is not explicit, its absence is felt immediately. The OUN, once seen as a tool, has become an unavoidable presence. German officers do not write this openly. They do not admit dependency. Instead, they describe operational difficulties in vague terms. Increased attacks. Unpredictable civilian behavior, loss of situational awareness. But between the lines, the message is clear. Germany no longer controls the environment it occupies. By 1943, the relationship has inverted. Where German command once believed it was directing nationalist energy, it now reacts to it. Policies shift rapidly. Arrests are followed by quiet negotiations. Suppression is followed by informal accommodation. The files read less like strategy and more like crisis management. This is the second collapse. Not the collapse of cooperation, which had already failed, but the collapse of confidence. German officers begin questioning the assumptions that guided their earlier decisions. Private correspondence hints at regret, though never explicitly. One report notes that nationalist movements cannot be neutralized without creating greater instability. Another observes that attempts to control them only sharpen their resolve. The contradiction remains unresolved because it cannot be resolved. As 1944 approaches, German war diaries grow terse. Entries shorten. Explanations disappear. The language of control gives way to the language of damage limitation. German command no longer speaks of shaping outcomes in Ukraine. It speaks of holding ground, delaying advances, preserving lines of retreat. Nationalism is no longer central to German planning. It is a factor among many, uncontrollable and unpredictable. And yet, it never vanishes from the files. Even in retreat, German reports acknowledge nationalist activity shaping events beyond German influence. Not as allies, not even always as enemies, but as actors with their own momentum, operating independently of both collapsing German authority and advancing Soviet power. This is where the records fall silent. There is no final assessment, no definitive conclusion, no admission of error. The files simply stop asking the question they once believed they had answered. Why did German command work with the Ukrainian OUN? The absence of an answer is itself the answer. German planners entered Ukraine believing nationalism could be weaponized without consequence, that it could be switched on, directed, and switched off when no longer useful. What the records reveal instead is a deeper failure of understanding. Nationalism was never a tool waiting to be picked up. It was an ambition waiting for an opening. Germany provided that opening, and then lost control of what followed. The final irony is cruel. In trying to avoid partisan war, German command created the conditions for permanent instability. In trying to suppress nationalist ambition, it ensured that ambition would never align with German authority again. The very secrecy of the files reflects this discomfort. There is no victory narrative to preserve, only lessons that could not be applied in time. The documents end without resolution, but the question remains. Was the failure inevitable from the moment German command misunderstood what motivated Ukrainian nationalism? Or did the failure emerge from hesitation, from the inability to choose between exploitation and suppression? The records do not say. They only show a power that believed it could control local forces, discovering, too late, that control was an illusion. The files close. The consequences continue. If you value stories like this, drawn from the uncomfortable spaces inside wartime records, subscribe to WW2 Never Told German Files, and tell us where you're watching from around the world. History does not always give answers. Sometimes it leaves us with questions worth arguing over.